Well, everyone, it's time for us to talk about one of my favorite phones that have ever came out, and it's actually the Samsung Galaxy Note 9. Now, this specific phone came out a couple of years ago, back out in 2018. It's going to be turning 4 years old this year, and in my opinion, like I mentioned before, this was one of my favorite phones that ever came out, especially from Samsung. This was the generation right before Samsung started switching up, and this was actually, I guess, the third in line to be last released in terms of the Note lineup from Samsung. So it holds a special place in my heart. This was also before they started doing two different Note, releases at the same time. And this was, whatever Samsung had at that moment, all the features, all the power, all the battery, they just threw it into one device, and it was the Note lineup, and I'm such a humongous fan of it. Now, I wouldn't recommend picking it up today, but there is the S22 Ultra that should be coming out that's going to be like the Note lineup replacement, so I'll keep you guys updated how that one goes. But I'll also leave some other phones I recommend this year in the description below. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Note 9, you can see on the front we still have that beautiful 6.4 inch Super AMOLED display, and it is still a very good looking panel. It's 1440p, and even now to this day, it's still one of the best looking panels of an older phone for sure, and I think it was the best panel of any phone that came out in 2018. Now, I think now it looks a little bit, the only reason it even looks remotely dated is the bezels on the top and bottom. There's no hole punch display and the lack of like 120 hertz or 90 hertz, but even that, when I'm looking at it now and I'm messing with it, like I just filmed this video for it, it's really not that big of a deal, and I'm actually a fan of the way this phone looks, as well as the build quality overall. Now, you have the USB Type-C port on the bottom that still supports Samsung DeX, which is awesome. You have a headphone jack as well, which is crazy. You have that S Pen, which is also really insane to have on this type of phone. It's like a stylus. I'm sure most of you know what it is by now. And you also have a micro SD card slot as well, which is super crazy. Now, as I mentioned before, when you have something like the Samsung Galaxy Note 9, you are getting such amazing I/O that is really, untouched as of this point. By having a phone like the Note 9, you are pretty much getting a solid phone with solid amounts of ports on it, which is still really cool. Now, on the back, we have a standard glass back, which still looks really good. You have wireless charging. You have that, fingerprint sensor on the back, which is in a pretty strange location. Luckily, they've since been brought to the front under the display, but this was one of the last Samsung phones to bring this type of capability. And we also have a dual camera setup on the back as well. Now, you have IP certification. You have very great build quality for the most part. This phone is still pretty big. It has a really good heft to it. And I'll definitely tell you, when it comes down to this type of phone in this type of day and age, it is a very good feeling and very good, looking phone. It doesn't look ugly. It still looks pretty good. And as I mentioned before, there's really not too much to hate on it without a doubt. So in terms of that covers it up on the outside. Now, camera wise, like I mentioned, we have that dual camera setup on the back, a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, then a 12 megapixel telephoto lens. And on the front, I guess we kind of had like a dual camera setup, an 8 megapixel wide angle lens, then a 2 megapixel iris scanner, which was just used for scanning your eyes and stuff. Now, with that back camera, luckily we can do 4K at 60 on the back, but we can only do 1440p at 30 on the front. So that's a little bit of a downside for that front camera. It's always good to have, like a 4K at 60 sensor on the front. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So on the back of this thing, I still think it looks pretty good. It still takes pretty decent photos. The images that this thing, is behind, it still looks pretty good. I haven't had too many issues with it. But like I mentioned, the main downside of something like Note 9, especially now, is that a lot of these applications like Instagram and TikTok and all these types of like camera focused apps, they don't really utilize the full Android experience, and because of that, you're really not getting that crazy great of a camera in those applications. However, with something like the Note 9 stock camera app, it is actually really, really good. Samsung does a great job at pretty much just posting as many features and just whatever features they have at that time, they just throw them in this type of camera. And I think in terms of that, Samsung did a really good job with that specific sensor in terms of the features they built in. Though maybe the only downside maybe I can think of is like that front camera. It's really not that great anymore, but I still think this back camera with the amount of features it has is actually pretty decent. So in terms of the camera setup, that covers it up there. Now, in terms of longevity, in terms of software too, I mean, this is the sadder aspect of this specific phone. We did start off with Android 8.1. We did get up to One UI 2.5, which actually actually was Android 10. It was based on Android 10, and it didn't get any more, features or software since then. I think it's gotten a couple of security updates here and there, but it is pretty much outdated, and that is kind of a disadvantage with this type of device. When you're getting a phone like the Note 9, you would want it to last as long as possible, and in this specific situation, that's not really the case. If you are planning on buying a Note 9, you are pretty much already outdated, and that's kind of what the problem is. As I mentioned, I don't want to recommend a phone to people who, if it's already going to be outdated in like a little bit of time, and that is pretty much what's going to be happening with this type of device. You are going to be getting a fairly outdated device when you already buy it, and it's only getting older, which is the sad thing to think about. So I'll definitely tell you, when it comes down to this device, it really doesn't make too much sense to pick it up anymore because of the longevity. Although it still has, great build quality, beautiful display, pretty good cameras, it's really not getting any more updates, and there's really no point in picking it up because of that. Even the Note 10 is a much better phone nowadays than this one just because of its software updates. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now in terms of the performance, this device does have that Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset with 6 gigs of RAM on the base model and then 8 gigs of RAM on the top tier models. And this is what I'll tell you about the performance. This phone is still a pretty good performing phone. I think One UI does kind of slow things down a little bit, but it's really not that big of a deal. And I do think this phone is still a pretty good performing phone when it comes down to it. I think for basic apps and everything, it's still perfectly fine. And with that big panel, it makes things look so beautiful still, even in 2022. Now you still have, a very good, amount of RAM on it too. 6 gigs of RAM for the base model, which is what I have, isn't really that, low amount of, RAM to have. So I think that's a really cool thing to keep in mind. On top of that, as I mentioned, if you're doing heavier intensive games or applications as well, this phone is going to be able to handle it too. There's really not a whole lot where this phone I've ever felt like, oh my god, it's so slow or it's super whatever. Because of the age of this phone, you kind of already know what to expect. And I think that's the best way to put it. You're not getting like the fastest phone in the world anymore. If you want it, you would go for something like the Note 20 Ultra or the S21 Ultra, or wait for the S22 Ultra. But I think this phone is still a pretty decent performing phone. And obviously if I had to use it, I would be totally okay with it. But there are other devices in the market now which rival this thing for probably, a little bit more money, but it's definitely worth the upgrade. Things like, like I said, the Note 20 is a better phone than this. The Pixel 6 is nowadays. Even the Pixel 5 is probably a better performing phone than this thing is now. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up in the performance segment. Now ending it off with the battery life, this thing had a pretty big 4,000 mAh battery when it first came out, and that was actually a pretty big size battery to have on this type of device. Like I mentioned, Samsung at this time was just throwing everything they had into a phone, and even at this moment, they still had a lot of capability with these phones. So I'll definitely tell you, this phone's battery life at that moment was pretty good. Now it's definitely showing its age a little bit. Like I mentioned, when you're getting a phone like this, you're not getting like the best battery life anymore, but it's still a pretty okay battery life for sure. My specific model has degraded a little bit, and that's kind of what the problem is. But other than that, I think it's a pretty good battery life for pretty much considering the age and the price. But even something like I mentioned, like I think a Pixel 4a nowadays, or especially a Pixel 5a, will have better battery life than this one for sure. So in terms of that covers it up there as well. And to be completely honest, I think the Samsung Galaxy Note 9 sits in a very, very weird spot. Hardware wise, it still looks and feels extremely premium. It still rivals a lot of the, like $700, $800, even $1,000 phones that we're getting nowadays, but it's still very outdated when it comes down to software. And that's the biggest thing to keep in mind. I don't want to recommend people to buy a phone if it's already going to be outdated shortly after buying it. And in this specific case, this device is already outdated, so it makes even less sense to buy it. I would highly recommend, if you have to go for the Note lineup, either pick up the Note 10 or Note 20. The Note 10 is the lowest I would go. I think the Galaxy S10 would be another beautiful device to pick up, but I think any of the 2021 phones, things like the iPhone 13s, the 13 Pro specifically, the Pixel 6 Pro, the Pixel 6, or the Galaxy S21s, those would be really good phones to pick up, but I probably would stay away from the Note 9 as of now, just because of the lack of software updates. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.